Yurdumarang, Yon Natti, Lachlan McDaniel. Baladu, Wirajirigibur. Ngatu, Yinjamali Gadigal, Ngorambangbo, Gadigal Mainbo, Mandango.
Kamusta? Elaine Laforteza with you again, and I'm so glad you could join me. The acknowledgement of country you just heard was in Wiradjuri and spoken by Lachlan McDaniel. You might remember him. We met him in the very first episode of our podcast, when we all learned how to say an acknowledgement of country. Lachlan's committed to reviving the language of his ancestors, as are many First Nations people across Australia. You'll hear from two of them in this episode. More than 250 First Nations languages were spoken on this continent before the British invasion. Today, around 150 languages are spoken, but many are endangered. So, if you're like me, wanting to understand and connect to First Nations ways of being, language is one starting point. But how does language connect to country? How are languages being revived? Let's hear from Lachlan about his efforts to learn Wiradjuri. And at this point, I'd like to flag that this episode contains references to colonial and frontier violence, the loss and suppression of First Nations language. Please take care while listening.
When I was a young boy, I had a few words in language that we were able to use, but we didn't know of any fluent language speakers. And then when I was in my early 20s, we came across Uncle Stan Grant Sr., who was starting a process of revitalising the Wiradjuri language. We were very lucky to have Uncle Stan, one of the few fluent in the language. So he was taught when he was a little boy by his grandfather, Wilfred Johnson. And Uncle Stan, he told me this story. He was playing in the park with his cousins, with his grandfather, and the police were walking by the park. And so Wilfred Johnson, his grandfather, called out to him and his cousins and said, come here, we're going home. Because at the time, the police were involved with the removal of children. And so he got arrested. Wilfred Johnson got arrested. And he was put in jail overnight for speaking the Wiradjuri language. That had a really profound impact on Wilfred Johnson. He vowed that he would never speak the Wiradjuri language in public. But thankfully, he remained committed to teaching Uncle Stan. So they would go out bush and he would learn in secret. If government authorities found out that children were learning First Nations culture, whether it be language, ceremony, dance, they were at a greatly increased risk of being removed from their family. Uncle Stan's grandfather passed away when he was around 15. He didn't have the opportunity to speak to another person fluently in Wiradjuri until he was about 40 and didn't really engage with the language in all that time. And then the Wiradjuri Council of Elders said, look, we understand you know some of our language. Can you please record it? Perhaps the greatest misconception is that once a language is deemed to be lost, that's like a biological extinction. And really the way that we should be looking at Indigenous languages in Australia, but across the world as a whole, is that they go into a state of dormancy. They go to sleep. They still exist. They exist outside of people. They exist in documents. They exist in country, in the sounds of country. And Indigenous people just have to go through a process of waking them up again if they go into dormancy. I would say my introduction to Wiradjuri cultural revitalisation took place more around our traditional garment, which is a possum skin cloak. It's something that kind of hadn't been practiced on Wiradjuri country for about 150 years. My dad taught me how to make my first cloak. And then from there I was thinking, well, what else could I do to get involved? And was aware of, the importance of language to identity. And so I thought that would be a great next step. So yeah, that's how I got involved with the revitalisation of the language.
Feels like you're reclaiming culture and heritage and history. My name is Lindon Coombes. I'm a Yuwallaroi man from northwest New South Wales, currently living here in Sydney and working on Gadigal land.
Like Lachlan, Lindon has been learning his language, Yuwallaroi. What was his motivation to squeeze language lessons into his busy schedule?
So my mother was raised on Brewarrina mission. It was an objective of the mission to destroy Aboriginal languages. It was a tool, a weapon of colonisation. And my mum told me lots of stories that when she was growing up, she would go hunting with her grandmother, who was known as Cooker. Apparently she was a very small but strong little woman who defied the mission managers and refused to speak English.
That's amazing.
And so when she was out on country with my mother, Cooker would speak in Yuwallaroi.
Wow.
My mum could understand but couldn't speak. For me, it was, having kids, thinking about their identity and how we remain connected to all of that. Language is an amazing way. I did a certificate one at TAFE on Gamilaroi, Yuwallaroi languages, so a lot of the languages have lots of overlap, similar structure and rules. At the time, being a parent and having the job that I do, spending 3 hours on a Monday night after a full day's work didn't always appeal, but I'm really glad I made the effort. Yeah, it was one of the best things I ever did. And the way it was taught, again, was so lovely, auntie and uncle, and they did it by telling stories, which is fundamental to our culture. And so some of the words that we'd see and hear just reminded me of people long gone that used to use that particular word or those words or sayings. I'm getting a bit emotional, but it was lovely. And so, it's something to, pass on.
Language is so powerful. It encodes memories, cultures, identities, relationships to country, histories. And this is why passing on language is so critical. It's about heritage. But it's also about acknowledging the more than 60,000 years of occupation on this continent. So is Lindon sharing his language with his kids?
Yeah, absolutely. So we make an effort to use Aboriginal words. So we're building our vocabulary. I think this is an issue for so many Aboriginal languages, is that they're in a process of rebuilding.
Are you well?
Yamundumarang. Yamundumarang.
Bathroom is over there.
Kumbingi yugdurai ganala. Kumbingi yugdurai ganala.
Uncle Stan Grant Sr. went through this process of going through old accounts of missionaries who had engaged with Wiradjuri people, getting the words they had documented to supplement his own. And through that, he was able to work with a linguist by the name of Dr. John Rudder. And they created the first Wiradjuri dictionary. Well, it's been turned into an iPhone app.
Do you want something to eat?
It's been turned into a TAFE language course. It's been turned into a university language course. I was fortunate enough to be able to do the Wiradjuri language course.
Are you two going together?
I was very proud to graduate, and Uncle Stan Grant Sr. was there at our graduation, which was lovely, and he was very proud and shook all our hands as we came off the stage. So that was beautiful. Yeah, so I'm very privileged to be able to learn my language and to think about, Uncle Stan's life, where you could be arrested for speaking the language. It's a tremendous change.
I am proud to be Wiradjuri.
Kira madali niya ba ito, Wiradjuri? No, adilan. Nagirjun dun niya ngariyawa.
The change in the status of First Nations languages is tremendous. And that's partly a reflection of the massive amounts of work that dedicated people, including linguists, have put into reviving languages. Much of this time-consuming practical and intellectual labour of rebuilding a language is like detective work, searching the archives to find documentation about words and their meanings. But the greatest challenge to reviving languages that have gone to sleep is that there are so few full speakers of the language like Uncle Stan, so fragments may be all there are to begin with when rebuilding a language. You could be lucky though, like Lindon. He discovered linguistic treasure in his family archives.
My auntie, about 5 years ago, gave me a whole bunch of old cassettes, recordings, and so now we have my grandmother probably back 50 years ago speaking Iwalaroy and listening to the structure, the rhythm, and as I'm talking I'm using my hands. That's another big part of lots of languages. People use their hands,
Yes.
but Aboriginal people would use that in a particular way, and their face and their lips. Yeah, I just became aware of myself then as I was talking. But the other one, Aboriginal people, you'll probably see it as they're talking, drawing in the sand.
Yes,
So they've got this visual going on at the same time. And that's how they tell stories. But yeah, there's always something physical
Gosh, and
going
very
on.
rhythmic as well. Yeah. Well, that's beautiful, which makes me think like language is not just what we hear, right? But it's also what we can see, but what we feel in our bodies and in our hearts. And I could go on. Yeah.
The other thing is that when you think about words and understand where they came from, because it is very much relational, there are relationships between the words and the country and the water. And so one of the lessons that I learned was around birds. And Auntie told us that you'll always know the bird's name because it will tell you. And so most of the bird names generally are kind of imitation of the bird's call. Probably the most common one is kookaburra, which is googabara in
cool.
language. So same as wan. I won't try and imitate a crow, but crow is wan. Sort of sorrowful call it makes.
The world around you actually has its own language, right?
Yes.
And that's how country speaks, or that's how you can hear country, I suppose is what I'm getting from that.
Just to go further on that, anyone, I think, who lives anywhere in Australia, there will be Aboriginal names, Aboriginal places in your local area.
Yeah.
And knowing or researching what those things mean, it is a way of making a connection to this country, because what it will do is also raise history about that area. There's many massacre sites that have called all sorts of really offensive things, but there's also these Aboriginal names that are named because of an animal that gives birth there or an animal that was hunted there. And so then you start a more historical exploration of that, but it's all hand in hand with language.
And it's that deeper connection to place, which I love that language can bring you there.
Sometimes Miss Fry, our teacher, she one time she showed us a map and it had different colours of the spaces of the Aboriginal land.
Oh, that's really cool. I think I've seen that map before, and it shows all the different countries. Did you see where we live? Could you see it on the map?
Yes.
Yeah, oh wow.
Can't remember what colour it was.
Well, I don't know, but yeah, I'd love to see that again. And I know in Evans, in your preschool actually, they were very good with showing Aboriginal histories and heritage and celebrating like NAIDOC Week and Reconciliation Week. That was really cool. Man, I learned so much from my kids, Violet and Evan. Even when they were in daycare and preschool, they had play-based art activities and storytelling with local Aboriginal uncles and aunties. And they bring home stories about our local area, which I've never heard before. I think this is super important. They're learning about Aboriginal place names and the importance of country from a really early age. So then they can make their own connections to the land where they live and play. And all that feels like a really positive step forward. Listening to Lachlan and Lindon speak about reviving their languages also makes me feel hopeful. But I'm wondering if Lindon feels the same way.
Oh, I have a really positive view, but it's been a journey, I think.
Yeah.
You know, it's going back to 2008 when I worked at the Department for Aboriginal Affairs in New South Wales, and we had a languages unit, and I was probably in a bit of despair to see the lack of resources, how, you know, few words there were in a particular vocabulary for a particular language, and I was just, how are we going to do this? There's so much that needs to be done to catch up. Now we have TAFE offering these languages courses. There's all these little sprouts that are coming up, and it's happened more quickly than I thought way back when I was in a place of despair. So I'm very much in a place of hope. And one of the things that surprised me politically, that Aboriginal languages held sway with people that would otherwise not be supportive of Aboriginal issues.
Yeah.
And I found it quite interesting because I was previously a Labor Minister advisor, and I was appointed to the Aboriginal Languages Trust under a Liberal government, and they set the Aboriginal Languages Trust up, so it seemed to just push past, I guess, traditional political thinking around Aboriginal issues.
That is intriguing, isn't it? So what is the New South Wales Aboriginal Languages Trust that Lindon talks about?
The Aboriginal Languages Trust is an independent agency set up under the New South Wales Aboriginal Languages Act. It's become something of a point of envy for people in language renewal elsewhere in Australia. My name's Dr. Alexandra Gray. I'm a research fellow and a senior lecturer at UTS in the law faculty. In my particular research at the moment, I'm looking at when governments in Australia use legal mechanisms to involve themselves in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander language renewal. In Australia, we now have a national target for strengthening Indigenous languages. That's part of the Closing the Gap target. At the New South Wales level, there's the New South Wales Aboriginal Languages Act, which was passed in 2017 and then commenced operation in 2020.
When you talk about the Aboriginal Languages Trust, when you say it's become a point of envy in terms of language revitalisation, why? What has been so successful with it?
It's particularly successful in that it is Indigenous-led. It is funded by the government, but it has been able in practice to be self-determining. There's no other organisation like it in Australia.
I was on the New South Wales Aboriginal Languages Trust, so it was the inaugural board. Yeah, there's this really nice learning community. You know, there's a lot of people now actually working in languages, getting paid to do it.
Great.
So all of those really good factors are driving that process.
Yungu Galanyin Nalawiri, Danayi, Nunawul Dara, Wangara Lin Jin Yin, Maran, Bolan, Bugarabang. Today, Mr. Speaker, we are meeting together on Ngunnawal country, and we acknowledge and pay our respects to their elders. I rise today to deliver the
This is the 29th Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull. In 2016, he began his speech in Parliament in Ngunnawal, the language of the traditional custodians of the Canberra region. He's the first Australian Prime Minister to address Parliament in an Indigenous language. But I was surprised to find out that he's just one of quite a number of politicians who have spoken in First Nations languages. Alex has also been researching Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander language use in parliaments around Australia. And the results are, well, interesting.
Overall, I found 86, and that was up to 2023. The Honourable Neil Bell, who is a politician in the Northern Territory Parliament, he gave his first speech in 1981, and part of that is in Pitjantjatjara, which is a language from Central Australia. He's not a Pitjantjatjara man, but the main reason was to acknowledge the particular people of his constituency through the use of their or one of their languages. The first Aboriginal person to speak an Indigenous language in the federal parliament was Senator Aidan Ridgway, who spoke Gumbaynggirr, a language from northern New South Wales, in 1999. Shortly before him, in 1998, another senator who herself is not Indigenous, Senator Trish Crossan, representing the Northern Territory, had spoken Gumaj, a language from the Arnhem Land region. Another really important one is much more recent, and this is the Honourable Cynthia Louis, who until recently was a member of the Queensland Parliament. She is a Torres Strait Islander person and the first person to use a Torres Strait Islander language in any Australian Parliament. She spoke Kala Layoya. It appears in the way she talks about it on the record, important to represent her own identity and the identity of her people. But it's also an important opportunity to get other people speaking that language. So the transcript record shows, for example, that the Speaker of the House then responds to her to say thank you in the same language. And I did a bit of digging and she's taught him that beforehand. Yeah. So she's used it as an occasion to teach the language as well.
That is amazing. And it forms that community.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Well, this is, something people might be surprised at, that there is this bipartisan support for Indigenous language use and people saying on the record, thank you, that's so important, congratulations, acknowledging that as an important step.
That's very cool. And also to say that in language, I think is so powerful. And do you think this is why politicians would use First Nations languages to build that kind of rapport, or what are the reasons, do you think?
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer because, of course, I don't know the reasons for every politician. But what might be interesting is that most people say it's not overtly political. There's no real political advantage that they're trying to gain through that particular use of language. For Indigenous politicians, it often seems to be to assert a particular historic place in a parliament that's traditionally been very exclusionary.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, to disrupt or to challenge Anglo-centric white norms of parliaments. Yeah. And some people go further, making it really clear that they're bringing Indigenous knowledges into the parliament through those languages.
Aboriginal ways of doing and learning and knowing and seeing and so on in this space, which is really that colonialism built, right? Yeah.
And I think that brings up a really important point. Language is not collateral damage of colonialism. It is a target of colonialism. And so all this language use in Parliament or the work of the Aboriginal Languages Trust or anything any government in Australia does, it's really important to see these moves both as potentially moving against that history, but also always having a risk of somehow perpetuating that colonial control over language.
I really love how you've said language is not collateral, because language is so connected to how we form identity and connection and community and family.
Exactly. And so, for instance, in the truth-telling frame, the recent report of the Europe Justice Commission in Victoria speaks to the colonial violence against languages and their speakers very explicitly, and it does so in the context of talking about land injustice. So it's not just a cultural injustice, but it is language as embedded in country and a connection between country and people that is disrupted.
So in that vein, I suppose, Alex, in what way are language and linguistic choices, are they related to social justice then?
Well, one would hope so. I mean, that this trend of Indigenous language use in parliaments is increasing is important as both an indication or a symptom of the move towards social justice in this space, but it's just one part of a much bigger puzzle. The language use itself is not the complete answer.
Alex is right, of course, and the road to reconciliation is definitely more complex. But language is the very human way we connect, and maybe that's why it feels like an easier way to approach potentially difficult issues, like racism, colonialism, and power.
Yeah, going back to my mum, her journey was being made to not only fear speaking her language, but to also be ashamed of it. And people were punished for using language. I think they understood the power of it.
Lindon, you said when learning Yuwalarai, it's also about re-engaging with your mum. So how does your mum feel about you learning Yuwalarai?
Yeah, she loves it. So she, as a young girl, would be able to understand Yuwalarai language, but couldn't speak it. And that's why, I felt quite empowered doing that. I think as we think about our family histories, that starts to, creep up on you, that I think not only do I want to do that, I think I have to. I think there's a bit of an obligation.
This is one of the reasons why I wanted to create and share this podcast with you. My Language, My Country is ultimately a celebration of our language diversity. The amazing progress First Nations people are making to revive their languages affirms this diversity. This benefits people like me because it recognises our languages too. It also encourages me to make sure that my kids don't lose Ilocano, my mother tongue. Language is a core part of who I am and who they are. And as new settlers, the small ways we can support language revitalisation can also contribute to the reconciliation process. One example is to encourage the use of First Nations names for our streets and suburbs. And as Lindon suggests, researching what place names mean can lead us to truth-telling about hidden or forgotten histories. In the next episode, I'd like us to diverge from these themes about language, though, and discuss an idea that keeps coming up over and over again in conversations. Saying an acknowledgement in our mother languages inspires us to learn more about First Nations histories and cultures. But many of us don't know where to start. How can we work together to educate ourselves? I'm Elaine Laforteza. Thanks for your company. Maraming salamat. Agyamanak.